Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Hanaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Now, for many years, the Lebanese Hezbollah organization was widely seen as the most powerful non-state military force in the world. Hezbollah's ascent from a militia to a dominant political and military force in Lebanon captivated the world. But after entering the war with Israel on October 8th, 2023, the organization suffered a series of devastating blows, leaving it severely diminished. The Middle East remains a crucible of global tensions, and Hezbollah's trajectory, from Iranian-backed insurgency to its emergence as a regional power, broker now to decline and reduced status, offer critical lessons. How did Hezbollah's alliances, ideology, and missteps shape its rise and fall? And what does its collapse mean for Lebanon, Iran, and the broader geopolitical landscape? Joining us now to discuss all of this is Michael Rubin, who is the Director of Policy Analysis here at the Middle East Forum, as well as a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And as always, throughout the course of this discussion, we invite our viewers and listeners to ask us your questions, which you can do by using the Q&A box located at the bottom of the screen. And with that, I would like to turn the discussion over to Michael Rubin. Thanks for taking the time to join us this week.
Thank you so much, Adnaf. The way I would begin this is that it would be premature right now to spike the football. Just because Hezbollah is down doesn't mean they are out, and it will continue to take some concerted policy in order to ensure that Hezbollah doesn't rise from the ashes. Remember, while Israel was brilliant in taking out Hezbollah's military leadership, several ranks and levels of its military leadership, as well as its rank and file array of fighters and terrorists. Hezbollah wasn't just about the military tip of the spear. It also had a substantial economic component behind it. And that's what I'm afraid we're turning a blind eye to as we move forward. So, for example, if we look at terror finance trials in the United States, there have been any number of Hezbollah finance and money laundering trials that involved both South America and West Africa. Hezbollah has enriched itself both in the triangle border of South America, and that's from where they ran the 1994 attack on the Jewish Community Center in Argentina, but it's also been involved in Venezuela and in places like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, Benin, and so forth. Lebanon's greatest export has always been its people, and it's those Shia networks, family networks, that on one hand supported Hezbollah when they were in Lebanon, but on the other hand supported the financing of Hezbollah with any numbers of businesses dealing with everything from used cars to drug cartels and drug smuggling that remain a problem now. So the question I would have is, what do we see both the United States and to a lesser extent Israel doing in order to ensure that the Lebanese diaspora in Africa, for example, or South America is completely uprooted? Now, for those of you who follow African affairs, you know that there's been increasing complexities in the region, especially in the so-called Sahel. That's the area between the North Africa Arab states like Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, versus the littoral areas in sub-Saharan Africa. You have areas of desertification, of savanna, and that sort of issue, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so forth. As France has been more or less expelled from those regions by a series of coups over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had the Russians come in with what used to be called the Wagner Group, but is now called the Africa Corps. And the question I would have is, if you have these Francophone countries that have large Lebanese diasporas, but you no longer have the French there to partner with, as if the French had ever really partnered productively with us when it came to Hezbollah, can we really rely on the Russians? And so if you have the Russians wanting to exact revenge or wanting to use Hezbollah as a lever, both in Lebanon and in Syria, is it possible that this contagion, this financial network, could somehow survive? Now, we do have some good news. While we know that Joseph Aoun, the former head of the Lebanese armed forces, is now president, and generally he's a very good guy. He's no relation to the pro-Hezbollah Michel Aoun, who came before him. While he wants to do the right thing, especially now that he has the opportunity with Hezbollah neutered by what Hudson Institute scholar Michael Duran called Operation Grim Beeper. The fact of the matter is, the presidency is only one important position in Lebanon. Arguably, the three most important positions are the presidency, which is held by a Christian, the prime ministership, which is traditionally held by a Sunni, and right now it's held by one of the judges from the ICC, which castigated Israel. But the third most important position is actually the governor of Lebanon's central bank. Here we also have some good news. Harvard University graduate Karim Suaid, a Lebanese Christian and a professional banker who had worked both in the United States and in the United Arab Emirates, has dedicated his life, even before this opportunity, to countering Hezbollah. He is now in charge of the Lebanese central bank, and so he can conduct the forensic accounting and close the loopholes, which Hezbollah exploited during the decades-long tenure of his predecessor, Riyad Salameh, who is now in prison and probably won't survive that because he's the man who knows where all the money is channeled. He basically knows too much. Hezbollah and many other corrupt Lebanese leaders want him gone. The question I have is, what are we doing behind the scenes to support Karim Suaid? One idea, for example, and one thing which Karim has said against the backdrop of the International Monetary Fund meetings in Washington, D.C., is that we have this opportunity in Lebanon, but what are we doing to show the people of southern Beirut and southern Lebanon, which used to be Hezbollah strongholds, that they actually stand to have their lives improve if Hezbollah's mafia state never returns? Now, here we come in, we clash with the cynicism of Washington, which tends to be opposed to foreign aid and tends, not without reason, to look at Lebanon traditionally as a morass of corruption. Is it possible, therefore, to sort of demonstrate and rebuild portions of southern Lebanon without using American money? Now, here there's actually an idea which we highlighted in the Middle East Forum Observer, our daily policy analysis. But it didn't just come from the ether. It was something that was being actively discussed in Lebanon and perhaps a bit at the International Monetary Fund meetings. And that is, if you remember, during the Biden administration, as President Joe Biden wanted to relieve pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran and to unfreeze Iranian assets, he agreed to unfreeze the Iranian billions of dollars, about $6 billion, which were held in South Korea. South Korea, during the Biden administration, wired that money to an Iranian escrow account held by Qatar. The question then becomes whether the Trump administration, despite what seems to be its soft approach to Qatar would be willing to confiscate the $6 billion worth of Iranian funds and reroute it to Lebanon as quote unquote reparations. Because without doubt, Iran's support of Hezbollah has brought nothing but disaster to Lebanon. Now, can Lebanese authorities be trusted with $6 billion suddenly flooding the coffers? No. But both the Lebanese president and the governor of the central bank would be very willing to have that money be coordinated by Western outlets, for example, a place like JP Morgan, which could ensure that that money isn't falling back into Lebanese Hezbollah coffers. And so, with this sort of creative solution, we can bypass the mood in Congress that doesn't want American taxpayers' money being thrown good money after bad. But at the same time, we can undermine the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps with maximum pressure, force Qatar to put up or shut up when it comes to determining which side of the issues they are on, and demonstrate that we can build some degree of normalcy in southern Lebanon. Now, I've driven all throughout southern Lebanon. I got so close to the Lebanese border, I was actually picking up the Israeli cell phone signal. And I remember as a 16-year-old going on a teen tour and seeing Metula in Israel. And I was maybe 20 meters away from Metula on the Lebanese side of the border. When I'm talking to Lebanese in those villages, many of them were sick to death of Hezbollah and what Iran has done to them by colonizing southern Lebanon through Hezbollah. They remember, and I went to the ruins of the border markets just north of Nahariya in Israel on the Lebanese side of the border. Because when Israel still was in southern Lebanon, there was a border market there, and people in that region say, we want those border markets to resume. The Lebanese aren't as anti-Israel, frankly, as in my experience, many Egyptians and Jordanians are. There is a real opportunity there, but we can't take our eyes off the game. We need to ensure that the new Lebanese regime is able to demonstrate victory. Now, I have about 2 more minutes, and I want to bring up one other issue in Lebanon. Now, we all know that in Lebanon, there's a confessional system. What that basically means is that the parliament is held by a quota of religious groupings. I mean, everything, we're not just talking about Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and Christians. We're talking about Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic, Armenian Orthodox and Armenian Catholic, Druze, and so forth. Now, traditionally, while in the United States, when I was in college, for example, I voted absentee back in Philadelphia, where I grew up. In Lebanon, you don't have absentee ballots. You have to go to your grandfather's ancestral village. What are we going to do? What Hezbollah would do is ensure that if they knew you were from an anti-Hezbollah family, you couldn't get through their roadblocks to vote. What are we going to do to ensure that in the next elections, Hezbollah is truly kneecapped by not being allowed to control any of the villages in which balloting will be cast? What are we going to do to ungerrymander some of these districts, which first the Syrians and then the Iranians imposed through their proxies in Beirut to ensure that Hezbollah always won? We complain about gerrymandering in the United States, but some of the gerrymandering in Lebanon was so extreme that voting districts weren't even contiguous with each other. They were bunches of balloons and holes separated by other voting districts out there. So we actually have a lot moving forward. And the question I have, of course, is whether the current administration actually has the attention span to get some of these reforms done to ensure that Hezbollah is not just down, but permanently out. And with that, why don't I turn the floor back over to you, Akhnaf, to ask some of the questions?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Michael. There's a lot to cover in just 15 minutes. So thank you. You've done a good job of putting it very briefly for us. I will begin with a question here from Professor Asher J. Matathias, who asks, can Hezbollah, in the manner that Hamas will be trounced as a military threat, be demilitarized, erase its educational system of anti-Semitism, admit outside moderate Arab and EU administration and instruction, slowly weaning their presence into Lebanon's traditionally more moderate society?
The short answer is yes, it is possible. Now, I live and work in the Washington, D.C. area now. And when I talk to people, policymakers, especially policymakers who disagree with me and who disagree with the general attitude of and policy positions that people in the Middle East Forum take, what they often say is, for example, Hamas or Hezbollah are just facts of life. There's no way to eradicate that ideology. And what I always throw back at them is, tell me whether we should have simply accepted the permanent existence of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which, after all, was a noxious ideology and responsible for the deaths of more than 1 million people. Or on a lesser scale, should we have just embraced the German Baader-Meinhof gang? Or should we have done what happened in both cases and ensured that those ideologies were completely delegitimized and ceased for all intents and purposes to exist? Now, there's an irony. As some of you know, I'm an alumni of a Quaker school, and I follow the American Friends Service Committee closely. And I know that the same American Friends Service Committee that now embraces Hamas and denies Hamas terrorism, and the same thing with Hezbollah, was once one of the chief advocates for the Khmer Rouge. But let me just leave that there. What I would say specifically from my experience in southern Lebanon, including meeting with ex-Hezbollah people that had just given up on the movement, is that Lebanese understand that the snake oil that was once peddled by the Iranians and Hezbollah has brought nothing but disaster to them. Now, Lebanon traditionally and culturally is a much more cosmopolitan country than many around it. This is often the case in maritime countries and so forth. And therefore, when I talk to ordinary Lebanese, I get the sense that they want to turn the corner on this. And I have more faith that Lebanon can do that than perhaps some of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
Now, that's a good segue into this next question. And you did preface your remarks by saying that maybe, we shouldn't be too quick to be too optimistic about the fall of Hezbollah, even though they've been crippled pretty heavily. But there's a news article in front of me from Ynet News, and the headline is, Lebanese army digs for weapons in Hezbollah stronghold after Israeli strike. And it seems, and you kind of maybe touched on this, it seems like the Lebanese government has taken an increasingly active role in, well, actually being the Lebanese government with Hezbollah weakening the way it has. And on top of that, you mentioned the internal dissatisfaction amongst southern Lebanese against Hezbollah and their de facto rule. Between those two factors, plus of course, the military campaign by the Israelis, do you think that there is a chance that we see the final days of Hezbollah's de facto rule in Lebanon?
You know, what we've already seen, and this comes out, for example, of videos in Dakhliya when the new head of Hezbollah talks and people ignore him. Unlike you could hear a pin drop when the late Hassan Nasrallah once spoke in these neighborhoods. What we see is that Lebanese are sort of confining Hezbollah to a much more minor position. That said, both the Russians and the Iranians aren't going to give up too easily. And what I'm afraid is that by not creating consistent pressure on the Lebanese government to continue to unravel the grip of Hezbollah, we could actually be snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Now, what we see both with the Lebanese government now and in other contexts, for example, with the Saudi government in Yemen, is while on one hand, intellectually, they may want to do the right thing, on the other hand, they realize that their survival is at stake. They don't want to stick their neck out the Lebanese government fighting Hezbollah, or Saudi Arabia versus the Houthis, unless they are sure that the Americans, the Europeans, and moderate Arab states will have their backs. And so what actually transpires is a lot of maneuvering, but not a willingness to give a death blow, because the locals there are going to, in Lebanon, or for that matter in Saudi Arabia, are going to need to live with the consequences of whatever decision is made. Now, I do want to just add one other complexity when it comes to Lebanon. When we look at Lebanon, too often we think in terms of the Lebanese government and Hezbollah, which was basically this Iranian imperial presence. But from a Lebanese point of view, they tend to look at Hezbollah and many of the other groups, Jaja's Lebanese forces or others, as all different mafia groups with slightly different colors and tastes to them. And so when the Lebanese are talking about a new Lebanon, they're not simply talking about fighting Hezbollah. They're talking about unraveling all the mafia groups which so distort the economy and are tied up in the personalities of various political elites.
All right, thank you. Now, while we are kind of on the subject of foreign support, foreign influence for Hezbollah, we kind of know Russia and Iran's stance on this, but something you touched on in your remarks was Qatar, and they're getting a lot of attention in the news today. Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Qataris and Hezbollah?
Look, the Qataris, if you want me to analyze Qatar intellectually, this is the way how I will explain their bad behavior. Qatar is when I just finished teaching my annual summer school class at the American Enterprise Institute and inspired Bernard Lewis. One of the issues I talk about is what is a legitimate country and what is an illegitimate country. When we look at a map of the Middle East, we have straight line borders and we have borders that aren't straight lines. Now, straight line borders tend to be artificial borders, but that doesn't mean an artificial country because most people in the region live along the river valleys or the coast. So it doesn't matter in Egypt, for example, where you actually draw the borders. And Egypt, most people understand is a legitimate country. Syria, even though Iraq didn't come into play until it didn't become independent until the 1930s, you had reference to Iraq in 13th century Arabic literature. That brings us to Qatar. Don't worry, I'm getting to Qatar. Qatar is one of the few countries, maybe Egypt and Jordan being the others, that really have no historical legitimacy. Now, at the same time, Qatar is one of only two Wahhabi countries, the other being, of course, Saudi Arabia. Now, when it comes to trying to define your legitimacy, when you don't have a great deal of self-confidence in your own nationhood, Saudi Arabia can point to hosting Mecca and Medina, the two holy mosques, and it can also point to being the birthplace of Ibn Wahhab, who created Wahhabism, this interpretation. Qatar has nothing. So in order to basically define its own identity with this fantastic gas wealth it has, it tries to punch above its weight. Now, what this has meant in recent years is supporting many of these Islamist groups for ideological reasons, especially Muslim Brotherhood-oriented groups. And so we have Qatar, for example, supporting the Gaza Strip, supporting Turkey in this unholy triad. But when we look at Hezbollah and when we look at their Islamism, we shouldn't exaggerate the difference between Sunni and Shia groups because they still have a lot in common. And they have that anti-Western perspective. Qatar also has close relations with Iran, which is Hezbollah's chief sponsor, because when we talk about Qatar being a gas giant, remember, Qatar's North Dome gas field and Iran's South Pars field are actually geologically the same field. They just have two different names because of an artificial border drawn in between them. Now, the only other issue with regard to Qatar, which I'll point out before turning the floor back over to you, Ahnaf, is that why does Qatar do this besides wanting to punch above its weight? It's the ideology of the king. But I'm confident when we look at Qatar, and when I talk to various people in Qatar, and I do Qatar more than other people at the Middle East Forum, There are factions there. Now, Qatar's not a democracy. It's as far from a democracy as you can get. But we shouldn't assume that just because the Sheikh Al Thani, the king of Qatar, is a diehard supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, that doesn't mean that people underneath him think it's a good decision. They have no power. What I would argue U.S. policy needs to do is A, hold Qatar to account, and if that means designating it a state sponsor of terror, so be it. But at the same time, we need to start thinking about off-ramps. So when the king of Qatar dies, perhaps there'd be someone in his place that isn't so sympathetic to this global Islamist terrorist movement and isn't willing to to basically fund terrorism throughout the region, and for that matter, Africa and South Asia.
All right, thank you. Now, moving away from the actual region, the regional Middle East, there's a question here from Stephen Holstein who asks, if you haven't discussed this already, what is the future of Hezbollah in Venezuela and the, quote, South American Triangle?
Unfortunately, when it comes to Venezuela, the future of Hezbollah is strong. And again, Hezbollah isn't just a terrorist group, it's an organized crime group. The two aren't mutually exclusive. And Venezuela right now, under Nicolas Maduro, is basically a narco state. It's an organized crime state, and we need to recognize the danger here. I should also point out that when we have had Iranian assassination attempts in the United States, oftentimes these have occurred in conjunction with cartels from South America or Mexico who are willing to do the dirty work on behalf of Hezbollah. And so we need to recognize this confluence between the ideological and religious groups like Hezbollah and some of the other criminal groups which we see in Latin America.
Now, bear with me here. This is a long question. It also comes from Professor Asher J. Matathias. Mr. Rubin's trenchant analysis and incipient optimism encourages me to follow up with this amazing prospect. No nation has long succeeded and prospered that has persecuted Jews. Every country welcoming them, most profoundly the U.S., has achieved enormous advances. Can we ever dare to foresee Lebanon taking the lead to invite its fleeing Jews back to be part of its polyethnic Lebanese society? And can we expect to see the normalization of relations with Israel?
Look, I don't think the Jews are going to be coming back to Lebanon anytime soon. However, as in Iraq, it wouldn't surprise me if Jews were able to visit their families and so forth. The decision whether Jews will come back to Lebanon isn't the Lebanese government just. It's also the Jews themselves, and many have settled elsewhere, have good lives, and aren't willing to risk what they see. Now, one thing that's common across the Middle East is we hear among the educated elites how good it was, and it may be sanitized version of the past before the Jews were expelled, and part of this is the grass is always greener on the other side. The problem is, while I may, and many diplomats may, interact with the people who are embracing the people who will talk about a return of Jews or greater tolerance, decades of incitement take their toll. And that's going to be a generational project to unleash or to reverse. And so in this case, do I see that Lebanon's true tolerance will return? This notion of Lebanon, of Beirut being the Paris of the Middle East? To some extent, it's going to lead that direction, but make no mistake, in the 19th century, Martin Kramer, the former editor of the Middle East Quarterly, once wrote about this. We had Alexandria in Egypt, and then the cosmopolitan center shifted to Beirut. Now it really is places like Dubai. And is Beirut going to be able to compete with Dubai? Really, I don't think so. But let's stop them from supporting terror and killing Jews. That would be a good first step. I would also say I'm testifying at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in Congress on Tuesday, June 10th, and about religious freedom specifically in Turkey. And it's not just the Jews. Diplomats often embrace the region with wishful thinking and way too much optimism. US policy is at its strongest when we calibrate our policy towards reality rather than to wishful thinking. And I would argue consistently the canary in the coal mine, not just in the Middle East, but in North Korea, China, and elsewhere, tends to be those regimes which embrace religious freedom are the ones who have truly reformed. Those who simply promise it, maybe Ahmed al-Shara is in this category, are simply pulling the wool off well-meaning diplomats' eyes, but we all suffer when we don't calibrate our policies towards reality.
All right, thank you very much. Now, we're just about out of time here, and I don't want to take up too much more of yours, but if you have time for maybe one more question here,
Sure.
we can end on one that might be a little more fun here. It's from an anonymous attendee who asks, the world was shocked by the pager walkie-talkie attack on Hezbollah, just as the Entebbe rescue did almost 50 years ago. What was the damage done at the time and the long-term effect?
Okay, well, the damage done at the time is I don't think Hezbollah is going to be many of the Hezbollah rank and file are ever going to be having children again. Just to put it mildly. But let me put it this way, and I recently wrote a piece about this in the National Security sort of journal 1945. The United States has a very bad habit of lecturing to people in the region, lecturing to Israel about how to wage its war, or for that matter, lecturing to Ukraine about how to wage its war against Russia. We have generals and talking heads who participate in Iraq and Afghanistan saying that this isn't how they would do things. But when we look at Iraq and Afghanistan, the outcomes of those wars weren't necessarily positive. And there's an irony, for example, during both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, it's a bipartisan problem of the so-called 6,000-mile screwdriver, which 20-something National Security Council staff wield when they themselves have never served in the military. Perhaps rather than lecturing to the Israelis about how they should be fighting Hezbollah or Hamas, we should have some humility and start recognizing that perhaps we should start listening to the Israelis, or in a different context, the Ukrainians, about how to be creative, how to think outside the box, and how to deliver the sort of blow which the Israelis did with Operation Below the Belt or Operation Grim Beeper.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we've seen, they can hold the most precision, calculated attack, possibly in the history for the last decades at least, and they still don't hear the end of it. Now, anyway, we have reached the end of our podcast for this week. I want to thank you again, Michael, for taking the time to join us, especially on such short notice here.
Anytime, Alnaf. It's always a pleasure.
Wonderful. Now, of course, your writing is regularly available on the Middle East Forum, Middle East Forum Observer. Is there somewhere else where, if our viewers and listeners want to follow more of your work, they can go to follow you?
Well, generally, I only use Twitter or X, not as a platform for discussion, but to distribute my work. So always go to the Middle East Forum website. But if you want to find work that is a little bit more further afield, then go to my Twitter, which is MRUBIN1971. You're not going to be besieged with a bunch of conversation back and forth. You're only going to get links to published articles or podcasts.
Alrighty, fantastic. And for those of you watching or listening on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, and elsewhere, I will be sure to put that that X handle into the description below, and you can go and follow Michael there. For our viewers and listeners, I thank you again for your viewership and your participation, and I hope to see you on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our Israel Insider podcast with Ashley Perry. I thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.